Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to See Political, the BallotCon, the day when we can all talk about the ballot measures for the November 8th election. Thank you to Nate Kaplan and See Political. My name is Dennis Hernandez. I'm on the board of See Political. And we're here today to talk about Proposition 59, the advisory opinion on whether to instruct Congress to overrule the Citizens United decision. I may or may not have summarized that correctly. I will, and that's why we're here. We're here to talk to two advocates, pro and con, on Proposition 59. To my right is Michelle Suter. She's the chair of the Yes on 59 campaign. Thank you for being here, Michelle.
Thank you, Dennis.
On my left is John Healy. He's on the editorial board of the Los Angeles Times. The Los Angeles Times has published an editorial in opposition to Prop 59. So I want to begin. I want to begin by asking Michelle an initial question about not necessarily the substance of the proposition, but what it does, what it proposes to do, which is, at least according to the pamphlet, proposes an advisory, and so the well, I'm sorry. Let me back up for a second. I'm jumping ahead in my outline here.
Okay.
See Political is about giving simple and concise statements about the ballot proposition. So if you would give a 1-minute introduction stating what the proposition proposes to do and why people should support it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dennis, and thank you, Nate, and See Political. So Prop 59 is, in our view, more properly called a voter instruction. And this is something that the last time we used it in California, which was in 1892, it led, in fact, to the 17th Amendment and the direct election of senators. So this kind of measure can have real teeth and real value. And what we are asking with this ballot measure is, shall the voters of California instruct their representatives in the Congress to draft and pass, and their representatives in the legislature to ratify an amendment to the Constitution that would restore our right to regulate money in our elections and would make clear that corporations should not have the constitutional rights of human beings. The reason to vote yes on this, you may not know that in the 6 years since the Citizens United ruling, 42 of our 50 states have taken some action, and this is California's opportunity to turn up the volume on the national movement.
John?
The legislature 2 years ago has already said, the California legislature has said that they oppose the Citizens United ruling. So this is a waste of voters' time, but that isn't why we are urging a no vote. The main reason that we do not like this proposition is that it's asking voters to tell legislators to do something the legislators will figure out eventually, right? Basically, it's saying, we want you to curtail the First Amendment, and we're leaving it up to you as to how you do it. That's terrible policymaking.
Okay, let's begin with the question I wanted to ask Michelle. There are 17 measures on the ballot. Some of them are pretty complex. This one is advisory, instructional, however you want to characterize it. So tell us, is this a waste of time?
Oh, certainly not. I mean, obviously, money in our elections corporate dominance over all of our policies is the issue that's driving the other 16 measures on the ballot and our election and everything that concerns us as a democracy. Dennis and John, you're both probably aware of the Princeton study, which came out in April of 2014, which looked at policy outcome data from 1982 to 2002, and they concluded that the people literally 0% of the time get their desired policy outcomes, while moneyed elites and business-based interest groups get their desired policy outcome 100% of the time. So the finding there, 8 years before Citizens United, was that we no longer live in a democracy. And that's what we are fighting for. To suggest that Congress or the legislature are going to, in John's words, figure it out eventually, does not consider the history of how constitutional amendments happen in the United States. And they happen because the people speak and speak again and speak loudly, and we are relentless. It also happens that we're right. And this is the thing that we must do in order to restore democracy. And far from rewriting the First Amendment, which some have accused us of doing, what we are actually doing is restoring the founders' intent in the First Amendment. You may recall that this country was actually forged in resistance to oppression and an oppressive corporation. That was what the Boston Tea Party was about. And we very firmly believe that if the founders and framers intended for corporations to have constitutional rights, they had plenty of opportunity in which to insert that into the Constitution, and it's meaningful that they did not.
It's interesting that we're only talking about corporations here, because Citizens United is not limited to corporations. It's any association, including unions. So let's just pause for a minute and think about Proposition 30. Proposition 30 was the bedrock of what got the state's budget back out of a crisis. Proposition 30 was the work of the California Teachers Association, okay? Now, Proposition 55 on this ballot didn't come through the legislature. The governor is silent on it. Would continue Proposition 30's income taxes. And who's behind that? The California Teachers Association.
Well, let me ask just a simple question. If I were a member of Congress and Proposition 59 is adopted or enacted by the people, am I bound to follow this proposition? Does it compel my vote as a member of Congress?
The short answer to that is no, it's not binding. But if your constituents, by their vote on Prop 59, express their desire for a constitutional amendment, I would hope that it would motivate both from a sense of obligation to constituents, to whom do you owe your fealty? In California, actually, 33 of our 53 members of Congress are already signed on as co-authors to one version or another, or in many cases, more than one version of an amendment that have already been introduced in the 113th, 114th, and we're certain that there will be constitutional amendments introduced into the 115th Congress.
Thank you. Question for John. So what's the harm? In other words, isn't a statement on a ballot proposition by a majority of the citizens of California a stronger statement of the will of the people than not?
But what are they saying? This isn't binary, like should we have direct elections of senators? Should people who are 18 years old be allowed to vote? Should there be equal rights for women? This isn't binary. This is a question of how do you restrict money in politics? We all acknowledge that this is a problem. But for 40 years, the Supreme Court has held that money is speech, in the sense that if you want to participate in the election process, the government cannot limit how much you say independently. It can limit how much you give to candidates, but it cannot limit your independent speech. Now, how do you speak? Well, you buy a TV commercial. You put something on the radio. You contribute to a group that is doing that. So untying that knot, that's going to be hard, and there's lots of different ways to do it. This proposition doesn't suggest any of them.
Before we get into the weeds on that particular issue, and thank you, that's a good statement of the position. Michelle, can you give us a little bit of background about this Citizens United decision, what it held, what it did, and by extension, why action is needed to, both in terms of a proposition by the people of the state of California and a constitutional amendment to fix whatever Citizens United did?
Sure, Dennis, and let me know if I'm diving too far into the weeds on this, but originally the Citizens United case was very narrow and asked if this group called Citizens United could show a film, Hillary the movie, in the run-up to the 2008 election when they were pretty certain that they were going to be contesting a presidential election versus Hillary Clinton. I think the court would have rightly found narrowly that they could show that movie, but what shocked the legal world was that the court was not content to simply decide that case, but they sent the lawyers back to look at this whole issue of money and spending. And I think it was on their agenda, and the result was that they eviscerated existing campaign finance laws and further found that corporations could spend unlimited amounts of money from their treasuries. And certainly, to John's point, unions could as well. I think we have some understanding of how different those treasuries might be, and so the impact on our elections has been plain for all of us to see in the billions and billions and billions of dollars spent and the kinds of coverage, frankly, that we get of our elections where the interest is all in the horse race and none of it is interested in issue because it's all about driving profit. So for us, Citizens United was really the cherry on top or the opening of the curtain where suddenly people could see what had happened, which also goes back to John's point of 40 years worth of faulty precedent, in our opinion, when the Supreme Court rewrote the First Amendment to say that money was the same thing as free speech, which we believe is, intellectually, viscerally, Socratically, any way you look at it, it's insupportable. I could, put a $50 bill on your computer, and I don't think for our remaining 10 minutes that it would have a thing to say to us. So it is, on the face of it, absurd.
Might say something to me. Let's try it. So what you're saying is the court's decision, the United States Supreme Court, when it decided this case, decided it on constitutional grounds, that is to say, the right of corporations to participate in the political process arises from the First Amendment. Question for John. So do you think that we really are talking in constitutional parameters? In other words, if any action is going to be taken, it has to be in response to this position, and the reason I'm asking this question is because the Times editorial said, well, maybe there's other means,
Yes.
Statutory means.
It depends on what problem you're trying to solve.
Okay.
If you think that the problem is that corporations and unions are allowed to have political speech, then you have to do something truly radical. You have to go back to more than 40 years of Supreme Court rulings, and you have to undo that stuff. Now, if you think that the problem is money in politics and the influence of money in politics, some things that you could do is you could start addressing the black hole of dark money, and you could have real campaign disclosure requirements. so that people can't contribute secretly to campaigns. I think that's a couple of really good things to look at. Watch what's happening in this state on Prop 61. Everybody knows that all the money in Prop 61 is coming from the drug industry. They do not want to have those price controls. It does not seem to be moving the needle, but we'll see. And if it could be, if the state defeats that, maybe the lesson is, if people know where the money is coming from, that's a political issue in itself, and that knowledge becomes power.
It raises an interesting question, that is the First Amendment issues that we're talking about here. And I want Michelle to address this issue. Is there what is your position with respect to the right of a corporation to participate in the political process? Is there any right? Is it protectable? And do you disagree with the Citizens United decision on that?
Right. I think there are a lot of problems with corporate participation in our elections. It is essentially saying some people get more votes than other people by that spending.
But that's speaking, not voting.
Okay. Oh, if you're going to interrupt me, I'm going to interrupt you too. Yes, but speech is obviously critical to our process and how we discern and all of that. There are, beyond that, are problems. You all reported this at the end of September, that Unite Here Local 11 has filed suit over foreign money in a ballot measure campaign in Beverly Hills, that this is a developer, a Chinese developer spending money in our elections. We know from the makeup of corporations that there is a lot of foreign money in all of these corporations who are spending a lot of money in our elections. That's plainly unconstitutional, and this is a real problem when you have an FEC that have publicly thrown up their hands as not being able to regulate, not being able to go after the coordination between super PACs and candidates, not being able to go after dark money. And if you think there are legislative solutions, for heaven's sakes, we can't even get disclosure passed in California. We've been trying to do that for 8 or 9 years. It's a different sort of emergency.
If I can interrupt, what's the difference between, say, a corporation giving money to a campaign and a Warren Buffett or a Donald Trump? I mean, is the issue the amount of money? I mean, is the issue the balance of power, or why corporations in particular?
Well, both are wrong. You know, when the D.C. Circuit, who heard the 1976 case Buckley v. Vallejo before it got to the Supreme Court, because it was appealed up to the Supreme Court, when they looked at that, what they spoke about was how damaging and dangerous and un-American it was to exalt money above all other values. And when we speak of political justice and whom should our representatives listen to, I'm reminded of the moment right in this chamber in December of 2011 when the Los Angeles City Council became the largest city in the country at that point to pass a resolution to overturn Citizens United. And in the public comment, and of course you know that in arenas like this, your public comments are limited, so there are arenas where we do limit speech. But a man came up to the microphone and said, if money equals speech, what does no money equal? And I think that that's extremely powerful and something that we should consider.
Question for John.
Can I respond
Yeah,
to
please.
that, though?
Yes.
We seem to be equating corporations with size as opposed to a
With
structure.
what? I'm sorry, I missed you.
With
size?
size. Just because something's a corporation doesn't mean it has a lot of resources. That's just a legal structure.
It's the
The
big guys
question
we're
here,
concerned about, though.
if I could
Yeah.
finish, the Supreme Court has never held that we have an equal right to be heard. It has always held that we have an equal right to speak. And repeatedly in the political cases that they've taken up, they've emphasized two things. One, political speech is paramount. It is of paramount importance in a democracy, in this democracy. And second,